There is something going on at Brooks Lake. I don't want to say reptilians or aliens because, well, frankly, I don't believe in any of that New World Order nonsense. The government is not trying to hide something from us. Why would they? It just doesn't make any sense. We're in the best country in the world, after all. But, even though I don't really believe in that stuff, that does not take away the fact that I saw something unexplainable. Let me start back from the very beginning. Back in September, I had about a week off of work. This is when I decided to pay a visit to an old long friend of mine who lives back in Wyoming. We haven't seen each other in a very, very long time. We were very overdue for a much-needed hangout. My friend's wife had come from a very small town in Wyoming, so naturally when he met her, they decided to settle down there, start a family, have kids. You know, the American dream. Anyway, after catching up with him, it's like we hadn't even left each other. It was back to the same old. Laughs, jokes, and all-around good times. Even his wife was amazing, and the chemistry was there. It's like all three of us together were a bunch of old friends that hadn't been together since high school, cutting up and laughing. Just a gay old time. We also had a few drinks after dinner to try and lighten the mood. This is when we start telling his wife all the crazy hunting stories we had together. Some crazy times, I will say. We talked all about shooting up some elk and deer by Brooks Lake. A fantastic time to be had. In fact, my friend was pretty adamant about getting up the next morning, heading off to Brooks Lake and doing what we had just been talking about, hunting. But I wasn't too keen about doing that, especially after just having a few drinks. I feel like he kind of strong-armed me into it, reminding me of all the fun times we had together. Of course, for me, I hadn't been hunting in a very long time. It had been years, and I had not handled a gun in many years since then. So, finally, he got me to agree, and we were set out to go first thing in the morning. We got up, bright and early, got all of our equipment together, had a nice big breakfast of fried eggs, hash browns, and biscuits, and off we go to Brooks Lake. I will say that at first, I was slightly concerned about the weather. It was rainy and overcast. I was hoping the weather wouldn't be too bad, but as we got there, things had cleared up, and now it was peaking sunshine, shining through the trees. It could not be a more perfect fall morning for being outdoors. It was so mild it was fantastic. You could just feel the excitement in the air. So I grabbed hold of my things, we got our gear, and we set out to hunt. My buddy at the time already had several spots set out that he preferred to hunt in. A couple of tree stands and a couple of good spots that he saw some good bull elk hanging out. Did I mention how amazing the scenery is around here? It's literally perfect. Even the way the sun was glistening off the water, everything was perfect. Now, we get to the first hunting spot, and my buddy tells me to shh. We don't want to scare away any of the bulls coming through here, especially once he makes his call. After all, we don't want to go home empty-handed. That would be self-defeating. I agree and begin. I start walking right behind him, but as the years kind of creep up on you, and you haven't done this in a long time, he begins to take off faster than I can keep up, and pretty soon, I'm struggling just to keep up with his field of view. After about the third time of him noticing me struggling to keep up, he suggests an idea. He would take me to a very good spot overlooking the entire area. From here, we could see just about everything we needed and could easily spot any big bulls coming through the area. His plan was to have me sit up there, while he went down and kind of drove them out into the open to where I could see. And of course, I would get to make the fresh kill, which I was totally down for. He showed me a spot, located behind some trees, overlooking good open terrain, where elk could make some wallows. So I set myself up, eyes wide open, finger on the trigger, ready, as any hunter should be. He moved forward then, silently, like a killer stalking its prey, circling around the area, searching for the first unlucky bull that would come in. So I'm there, waiting, scanning the area ahead of me, looking for any sudden movement. But time stretches on. After about 10 minutes, there has been zero activity, which is a little strange. Usually, this area is bigger, and far busier than a place full of salt licks. I figured we just need some extra time. After all, when you're hunting, patience is everything. So we had no choice but to continue to wait. About another 20 minutes rolls around. My friend is nowhere to be seen. I'm beginning to get tired. Then I start looking up all over, and not just through my scope, seeing if I could spot any movement, as to maybe give me some clues where he might be. That's when I see movement coming from a trail right around me, maybe only 10 feet away at most. I readied my rifle. The animal seemed to be approaching very quickly, and suddenly, which caught me off unexpected, stepping out of the trees was this humongous humanoid lizard-looking thing, around 6 feet tall, running full speed on 2 legs. Its eyes were blood red, looking ready to kill and mangle. It had 3 toes and 3 fingers, each with long curved black claws at the end of each, like it could have grappled onto its kill. In that moment, I cursed, feeling a chill go down my entire spine, and all my bones in my body, turning to hard stone. What was I going to do? Out of reflex, I fire my rifle. It was just reaction, not even thinking, when just like a soldier, in those moments, you have to know how to react, because a second of thinking will cause you to die. The shot landed right on this thing's chest. I know for a fact I hit it, but it's like the bullet didn't even do anything. It stopped and kind of looked down at its chest to where I shot it, as if some flimsy mosquito had flown by and bit him, hardly doing anything to him. I know a .22 isn't a machine gun or a .50 caliber, but my gosh, anything or anybody getting shot by a bullet should still feel something. Then it very slowly lifted its gaze up, looking right back into my eyes, as if now this thing was pissed, ready to enact revenge. So this creature lunges and jumps at me, grabbing a hold of my body like a little puppet. It takes hold of my right arm, squeezes and twists, and I feel my entire right arm shatter as the bones almost splinter out of my skin. It was the most excruciating, burning pain I have ever felt in my life. This thing hissed, almost like it was enjoying, getting pleasure out of seeing me in excruciating pain. Whatever this evil thing was, I was at its mercy. It had the power, the strength to tear me into 2, but it didn't. It's like it was a child picking up a little ant and finding joy out of ripping each little leg off the body. That's what I felt like. That helpless little ant getting his legs torn. The only thing that distracted me out of my agony was a few gunshots, and I opened my eyes. My friend was right there at the tree line, firing round after round into this thing, where it threw me up against a tree, almost breaking my spine, knocking me unconscious. The next thing I know, I'm waking up moments later, my arm completely useless, and my back aching, and my friend covered in blood dragging me back to the car, telling me he had to get me to a hospital now. There really wasn't much conversation. When we got to the hospital, he explained to the doctors that we came in contact with a large black bear, a mama bear, perhaps, who had cubs around. Although, after the doctors observed the damage to my arm, I don't think they necessarily believed him, because there were no bite marks. It was as if something very large had grabbed hold of my arm very tightly, twisting it and snapping it, like a small stick. However, there was nothing pinpointing it to him doing it, so I think it was eventually let go, and just not talked about. Our wives were on the way to the hospital. While I was lying there in bed, he jokingly told me, "Yeah, I didn't find really much elk in the area. It seems that something had spooked them off. What I assumed to be whatever was attacking you, that giant darn lizard." He said he had found remains of an older elk, but it looked like it had been torn to pieces and dead for quite some time. When our wives got there, we just played off the old black bear story, and that seemed to have them believe us for the time being. There's no way we're going to express to them what we really saw, that some giant evil iguana tried to basically tear me into 2. That really wouldn't go over so well, and even to this day, trying to process all of this is still very difficult, as you could imagine it. Fortunately, my right arm has made a full recovery, and I could use it again. But man, for about 4 to 6 months after this, it was pretty excruciatingly painful to even try and move it or use it. Driving halfway across the city and the Aslop Lake is something we've been doing since teenagers. My best buddy Charlie and I have this pact for whenever things get really bad in each other's lives. We are to drop everything, meet up together and have some beers and fish at the lake. That's kind of our way of escaping. Call it a man's thing or not, but it's something we find very relaxing. And after several bad breakups and other traumatic events in each other's lives, it's proven to be very, very successful, time and time again. While this was easier to manage once we were in high school, and even for a short period outside of high school, now that we're both employed by very big employers, it's much harder to find the time. However, we're still somehow able to manage to make it work. I don't know how, but I guess where there's a will, there's a way. Don't ask me what my fascination with this particular lake is. It's just how it's been all this time. Maybe there's some sort of bond or memory stayed there. Now, let's take things back a few years in high school, where Charlie had probably his worst breakup of all time. I won't go into all the unnecessary details, but his girlfriend at the time, who he was very in love with, had cheated on him multiple times with different dudes, and he was devastated. So, there we were, honoring our pact, there at the lake early in the morning, trying to take our minds off the disaster that was real life outside this beautiful lake. We were driving through Carroll Lake Road, all of our fishing gear in the back seat. I don't remember if we had slept prior to that 3 a.m. drive. We were both pretty amped up on energy at that point. Maybe it was the rock stars we had drank. Maybe it was just the pure and sheer excitement of having this pact together. I was driving, while Charlie seemed to be on his 100th can of beer. It wasn't that much, but he was pretty drunk at this point. I think trying to shove down his feelings deep in the can. At this point, it was now about 4 a.m., and the roads were pretty empty. It was also very quiet, minus the music blasting through my car's speakers. But the night was unusually silent. The music was so loud, I'm surprised it didn't give us permanent auditory damage, but we were young and stupid. I don't think we really cared. And if we did, it was easily the last thing we cared about. But it seemed like the more he drank, the more depressed he became, recounting every time that he had the feeling they were sworn to be together forever. Young love. You know how it is. I felt bad as a friend. When it came time to try and comfort him, I felt sterile, useless, and completely like a statue. And suddenly, out of nowhere, rushing from the side of the road in front of the vehicle, stopping. It happened so fast that I thought it was maybe a deer or a really large pig, until I focused my eyes more, and the hair on the back of my neck stood straight up. I slammed my brakes as hard as I could, with Charlie spilling beer all over himself, being as drunk as he was and slamming his face against the dashboard. That guy never uses seatbelts, even to this day. He just yelled out in pain and confusion, unsure of what had happened. And I merely pointed to the thing in front of our vehicle. I can tell you this, what we were looking at was in fact not a deer or a pig, at least none that I'd ever seen before, because I'm almost certain that this is no animal I'd ever known existed before. Its lower body was covered in dark fur and had 2 legs, kind of like a human being, but the feet appeared to be large and circular, like hooves. The legs were also very well built, and the hair, while long enough, you could still see clear muscle definition. It was this animal's upper half that had me terrified. It was very muscular, especially the chest. I'll never forget just how large its pec muscles were. They were almost rippling under its hair. Its biceps and triceps were huge, almost exaggerated, and its arms as long as they were, hung down to its knees, with these insanely large hands, each having large claws on each, and the head was kind of somewhat of a mix between a bull and a wolf, something I had a hard time understanding. I could mainly just see the snout, and the piercing eyes staring back in the car, as if pissed we had somehow seen it, like it did not want to be seen. On top of its ears were large tufts of hair, stringy hanging down, and these large black horns, poking from the back of its skull upwards into the sky. It reminded me very much of the way a gazelle looks, the same kind of shape and horns. What the heck were we looking at? It was maybe 5.5 feet tall, maybe 6 at best guess, but the horns reached high up, making it in total over 7 feet tall. It looked like some sort of failed science experiment or military experiment. I don't know. Like if you took several animals and made some sort of weird mutant chimera hybrid out of them. Its eyes glowed a piercing, crazy yellow as the Chevy's headlights shined into it. There was just a stare down between us and it for a couple of seconds. Now that I think back to it, I wonder if our obnoxiously loud music had somehow disturbed it. It's not like this thing was running in towards our vehicle to try and intercept our travel. We were just scared for our lives. What if this thing tried to attack? Would we even be able to defend ourselves? I mean, we didn't even know what it was. It was just some freak of nature we were looking at. Some creature we were vastly unfamiliar with in every way, shape, and form. Not to mention, we were just kids. We knew nothing about the outdoors, let alone defending ourselves from large creatures, like bears and such. I would later find out, and I'm not really surprised, that Charlie was nearly on the verge of passing out. Not because he was intoxicated, but because he was so full of fright at what we were both seeing. And this is not a case of him being too drunk. We both saw the same thing. I don't care how much alcohol you consume. Nothing, and I swear there is no alcohol on this planet that will make you magically see this thing. And again, I was sober too. We both saw the same thing. You can't make this up. Eventually, it turned its head, breaking the gaze and jumping down towards the ditch on the other side of the road, which leads off into sort of the marshes. It all happened so fast, we did not even have the proper time to digest and process what we had just seen, let alone the fact that it had just disappeared from our view. To be honest with you, I was in no mood to play FBI agent, ask questions, and try to figure things out. This was a call for Scooby-Doo, not I. I sped down the road, turning around and missing the turn we needed to go down to the lake. Not tonight. Ripping at high speeds past pretty much everything else, straight back home. After a few more moments of silence between me and Charlie, he finally broke it, putting the beer cans down and slowly turning down the music. Even though I had kept a gun in the back seat, the sighting of whatever it is we saw had made my mind go blank. Emotionally, I felt blank. I wasn't sure what to feel or how to think, but I knew I was terrified by the sight of it. And I knew, had that thing tried to attack our vehicle, I don't know, honestly, if I would have had it in me to reach back there and pull the weapon and do what I need to do to defend my life. I can't say that I could. The entire inside of my car just felt far too vulnerable, as I would sit there, waiting, motionless for this thing to either come and kill us, get it done already, or leave, which thankfully it did do. And after this night, my friends and I, Charlie included, had gone back to the same spot to investigate in the following weeks. We even had come to the conclusion we would try and hunt it. Maybe we can keep its head as a trophy. But finding a taxidermist who would take care of that is another story. Anyway, we found nothing. No traces of it anywhere. No tracks, no bones, no scat, nothing. For what it's worth, it probably worked out for the better. I don't think even us in a group would have been able to handle finding it again, let alone evidence of it, proving it existed. Monster or not, I guess we had no right to try and hunt it, just to satiate our curiosity. And even now, I often reflect back, wondering where it is, as fascinating and terrifying as it was. Are there more of them? Do they just inhabit this one area? Maybe they come from a different section and move through, like how certain animals move through areas seasonally. Man, do I wish I had a dash cam or had taken some sort of picture of the thing. If you've read this far, I appreciate you for giving me the time of day. I've told a few people about this story, and they just claim that me and Charlie were drunk out of our minds and just somehow either made the story up or imagined it. And I always retort with critical thinking. When, ever in the history of anybody ever getting drunk, do they see things like this? That doesn't matter though. They've made up their minds, decided that we were too drunk and just saw something out of the corner of our eyes, something that we would turn into this supposed monster. It's really frustrating for people who claim to be skeptics and don't want to believe. Yet, they don't want to apply alcohol common sense. Besides that, I've tried to do research before, although everything points to it being called a cryptid. I don't know much about those, but that's what it seems. Some sort of creature, but I can't find exactly what. Maybe a goatman or a minotaur, but it didn't quite look like either of those things. The eyewitness descriptions of both of those creatures did not quite match up with what I saw that night, with what Charlie and I saw that night. And it's things like this that make you really reflect back and think how many undiscovered species or creatures are currently roaming the planets and the jungles right now. Think of all the uncharted territories, forests, jungles, and portions of the world mankind has never set foot into, and all the amazing creatures we have not yet seen or discovered. Terrifying or not, most people even now will probably not believe me, but at least I have a conversation starter. Do you believe in monsters? This was back in 2016. My son, who has Down syndrome, had won a poem recital contest. We were now driving from Cheyenne, Wyoming, down to Salt Lake City in Utah. We were heading there to celebrate, to visit some family for a good time. We had filled our car with every essential you can need for a road trip. After about 3 or 4 hours on the road, I began getting driving fatigue and decided to stop. We could eat some snacks and good food, and just take a break, and give my eyes a rest from staring at the continuous, infinite road ahead of me. That's how highway driving feels sometimes. We were actually right near an Albertsons, so we got out and decided to go in the grocery store and get some extra things for food and snacks. I unclipped my son's seatbelt, making him hold my hand since he had a tendency to run off. We walked in the store, and we grabbed a few grocery items along with some other miscellaneous supplies, deodorant, toilet paper, and I think even some toothpaste. And I don't remember at what point it was, and I realized my son had no longer been holding my hand like I had initially thought. Maybe I just become so engrossed in shopping that I had not even thought about it. So I started frantically looking around for him, and I saw him. He was standing out there in front of the store at the very entrance. It was very cold outside during this time, so I thought he was freezing. I brought him inside and made him wear his jacket. The only thing that was strange was during the whole time we were shopping, he was acting very off, acting very out of the ordinary, and I couldn't quite figure out how. Just his mannerisms were strange and different, not like my son usually is, but I did my best to ignore it, thinking maybe he was just bothered by something or something was up. We checked out and I was now leaving the store, again with my son in my hand, and we're walking in the parking lot. Now, my car is parked almost at the rear of the parking lot, where there seemed to be a large crowd of people, along with a bunch of commotion. As I began walking closer, I realized the crowd is actually closer to my car, and the closer I move and walk, I realize then the crowd is actually surrounding my vehicle. I heard all sorts of curses and defamations of somebody being irresponsible. I could not quite understand what was going on. After I approached the crowd and could visibly see the front end of my vehicle, to my shock and horror, in the passenger side of the car is my son, sitting there, asleep. I immediately look over and my son is no longer being held by my hand. He's somehow in the car. 1 second he was just here, out with me, and the next he's in the vehicle. My whole world seemed to spin and blur out for a moment, and I was deathly confused. The only thing I wanted was to get through the crowd and get my son out of the vehicle. I nearly got beaten to death by the angry mob threatening to take my life for leaving my small son in the car all by himself. After trying to explain it away, nobody believed me. They ended up breaking the back window on the driver's side to get my son out. The sound of shattering glass scared my son, and he began crying. I held him to comfort him and tell him he's loved, trying to figure out what exactly was going on. Because, remember, I'm very confused by everything that is happening. Nothing is making sense anymore. It's all just a big blur. And as the crowd began to dissipate, I still felt the same eyes burrowing into my back like I did before, even though the crowd was never looking at me, at least not as I approached. And now I began looking around. Since the crowd had cleared away, I was not sure where the source of this sight was, the source of these feelings of being heavily looked at. And then, as I look more, my eyes catch it. Coming from the store, in my direction, was my son, or what I thought was my son. The same height, the same stature, the same clothes even the same way he walked and moved was all my son. But I could tell that he, or it, was clearly not my son. This person or thing had no face. I was dumbstruck and petrified with fear. My son gripped me tighter and began crying, asking me, "Who is that?" It was very scary to look at. No eyes, no nose, and no mouth. Just a blank slate of flesh where any features should rest. And now my sanity began to be questioned. Had I somehow left my son in the car this entire time and gone into the store, holding the hand of this imposter, this doppelganger, this mimic, having physical contact with something that maybe doesn't exist? How could this thing have no face, and yet resemble my son, and trick me into thinking it was? I was so frightened by all these questions that I was now haunted by. I started my vehicle, getting ready to pull out of there. When I looked up again, I could see he was now closer, approaching our car. And you know that bad feeling that you'll get sometimes when something bad is about to happen? That's what I felt. It was just brewing in my stomach, as if this thing or person came up to our car. I knew nothing good was about to happen. And now, my son was a mess of tears and crying. Whatever this person was or it wanted, it was really scaring him. And now, I was scared too. And as I pulled out of that parking spot and sped off towards where the highway pulls in, I looked back and saw that the person or thing that had resembled my child, my special son with no face, had now taken the shape or form of an old gentleman holding a cane, who was just staring blankly at me and my vehicle, just standing there. Life and everything around me moved in slow motion, and I had a hard time even processing what was going on. So I whipped out of there, back onto the highway, heading to Salt Lake City, trying to get back away to where we had originally planned to go. It's been a good 5 years now, and I am still haunted by these memories. And I'm convinced that we encountered some sort of demon, something evil from the realm of hell, because I simply have no other conclusions. And take it from me, I'm not much of a superstitious person, or I'm really much of a believer in religion, but this is just something even too much for me to bite. It was too terrifying, it being the actual one who experienced it myself. I think next time, if I encounter this person or thing, I'm going to do what other people do, and start praying, hoping it goes away for good. I can happily say I have not seen it since, and who knows what it was doing there, and why I was targeted. This story happened to me when I was only 16 years old. Me and my brother were camping at the Yellowstone National Park, just him and I. That afternoon, we threw all of our camping gear into his tiny beater, and drove there, making camp and fishing, talking about girls and other irrelevant stuff. Stuff that's important to teenagers. Now, keep in mind that this was years before the popularity of smartphones and things like that. So, we were pretty much on our own, having no screens stuck in front of our faces. A much different time than now, and I kind of miss it. I don't think we really remembered how long we were going to plan on staying there. It was some sort of mix between juvenile freedom and a thirst for adventure. At nighttime, we would always try and wander off and explore, see how far we can make it before getting too spooked and returning back to camp. We kept trying to scare each other. That's just how stupid we were, though. That, and we just loved goofing off. After all, the outdoors is where we were meant to be. I could just feel it. It was someplace special, someplace that I really held dear to my heart. Being a little kid and all, it really meant a lot to me. We didn't really grow up in the best neighborhood or the best household, what with mom and dad fighting all the time. So me and my brother would always escape to the woods. It was special for us. It was like a drug we could never get enough of, and it was harmless, and there was always more of it. That love, that escape, turned into a passion the older we became. But as we began to have this experience, our love for the outdoors would be greatly challenged. We were there for maybe 4 days. I don't think any more than that, when we saw something we can't explain. It was later on during the night, and my brother and I were set to take another night walk, like we had been. Our moods were great. We were elevated. Looking back, I think we were chatting about girls, but I can't remember exactly. At the time of this happening, my brother was about 20 and would soon be returning to college, so he only had so much time to spend together. At some point or another, my brother began to get really nervous, acting different, not like his usual comfortable self. He began telling me to stay quiet. Something was up, so I just sat and obeyed and listened to what he had to say. He looked very tense, beginning to turn his head. We hadn't even got that far, and we were just returning to our campsite. I can remember the atmosphere around us just felt different. Everything felt off, and my skin felt like crawling, like there were bugs under my clothes. Everything just felt wrong, and I realized why. My brother was so wary. Something was very out of place, and I could not pinpoint what it was. But he was on edge, and that in turn made me feel on edge. I was now very bothered by what was going on. And something else I noticed is that everything around us had become eerily quiet. No sounds of trees or leaves rustling. No normal sounds accompanied by the night. Like crickets and other normal night sounds. It was very, very quiet. And suddenly, my brother burst off into a sprint, running back towards our camp. I had no choice but to run after him. If he was running from something, then it must have been dangerous, and I needed to follow in his footsteps, quite literally. When I caught up to him, I begged and begged to find out what was wrong, but he only tried to keep me quiet more and more. He held my mouth and pointed off, not too far away. A large black figure was stalking our campsite. This thing was tall and covered in dark black fur. In that moment, I felt bad. We had left food out, and God forbid if it really was a bear, our campsite would have been destroyed. But then it did something that scared my brother and I even worse than we were already scared. It stood up. What looked to be a cross of a wolf and a gorilla, or some sort of elf-looking creature. But after all, this is Wyoming. Things get pretty wild and crazy out here. This primal fear overtook my entire being, settling into my body. I can't even begin to describe to you the terror that we felt staring at this creature. We realized this was no bear, or a person. Had it been somebody rummaging through our stuff, we maybe had a chance, but we had no chance against this. While fascinated staring at such a strange creature, we also felt fear. It was like it was looking for something, kind of rummaging around and sniffing. It hadn't noticed me and my brother yet, which was probably a good thing. It appeared after some time to maybe have gotten bored or possibly not find what it was looking for, and disappeared off into the darkness. My brother and I slowly approached our tent and just took shifts, sleeping, unsure if this thing would return. And if it did, there's no telling what it would have done or how violent it could have acted. A risk we were not willing to take. The very next morning, we saw the strangest paw prints one could ever expect. Ones that still stand out in my mind as to not making much sense. They were canine in nature, but just much, much larger. We quickly decided to cut our trip short and pack up and leave. There was no telling if that thing was going to return that night, and if it did, we did not want to be caught off guard. We did not have the right weaponry to handle such a creature, and especially if it planned on attacking. Lord knows it would have eaten both my brother and I. This story happened more than 10 years ago, and I'm finally prepared to share it with you. I really don't like talking about it, or even trying to remember it. It was that rough. It still gives me chills, but I figure writing it out is probably the best way to get it out of my system. The only other person in my company was my little sister, and she was just a toddler back then. She was only about 2 or 3 years old, and her speech was very behind. She only knew a very small amount of words. We were traveling with my parents, something I loathed because it would often entail them taking off and me being stuck with my little sister, playing the big sister babysitting game. Not something I was ever truly fond of, but yet here we are. We were walking around northwestern Wyoming. We had just settled a picnic, with lots of springs, currents, and geysers around. It was beautiful, but at the same time, it felt lonely at times, with my parents constantly taking off. My little sister, mind you, was an extremely active little girl. She was always wandering off, and this was no different. She began wandering off, and instead of my mother being the responsible mother she should have, she lent it up to me to follow after her, to make sure she stays out of trouble. Sometimes, I feel like my mom was lazy, and made me do a lot of the motherly work that she should have been doing, but that's another story. I argued and fought and didn't want to, trying to convince my mom that she needed to step up to the plate, but my dad stepped in and demanded I go look for her. I had no choice, so I start running towards my sister, who had just moved very close to a large pond. You know how little kids run pretty fast, right? Well, they run even faster when apparently you yell at them to stop, because they think that incites chase or that you're playing with them. So that's what happened. And luckily for me, she stops right at the base of the pond and just stares off into it. Thank goodness. Which made it much easier for me. That means when I would go to grab her, I wouldn't have to deal with her yelling and screaming, and taking her back to my parents would be easier than I expected. So I finally get to her side, as she's standing right by the pond. I did not like the idea of her falling in, regardless of how deep it was or not. It was just not safe. After all, toddlers and water don't really mix well. Unless, of course, it's a bath, but that's a different story altogether. And as I go to grab her, there's movement beneath the surface of the pond that takes my world, it takes my breath away. I looked and it was a woman's face, eyes closed and hair flowing. The face was coming up to the surface, not like somebody had dove into the pond and was coming up, like a body floating up towards the surface. And before the face reached the surface, the eyes opened, staring right at me, and the eyes were black, and the face began to contort and change into something else. It wasn't a human. And while all of this happened within 3 seconds, my little sister was incredibly fascinated at what we were looking at, making those little high-pitched squeals and sounds like she was just so enamored with what we were seeing. I was not going to stick around for another second to see what happened next. I grabbed Anne, my little sister, as tight as I could, and sprinted all the way back to where my parents were. The entire time, my little sister struggling, kicking, and screaming, because she did not want to leave. I was pale and sweaty when I had returned to my parents. Of course, they didn't really care. So I just wrote it off and told them that, well, she almost fell in the pond and drowned. Maybe we should move areas. We decided to get up and move, and thank goodness. And now, whenever I think back to this horrible memory, it still frightens me. A lot, actually. And sometimes at night when I'm dreaming, I still see that hideous woman and her face changing and contorting, and those black eyes coming towards me in my nightmares. My little sister, who's now 12, having just turned 13, has no memory of it whatsoever, at all. She's the lucky one out of both of us. I'd pay good money to have this memory erased completely. But no, it's this reoccurring nightmare that I'm stuck with forever. I'll never forget how rare of a weekend it was when my dad had finally got time off work to spend time with us. A much-needed reconnection. To make the most out of this weekend, we decided to camp at the Yellowstone National Park, one of my favorite places of all time to visit. If you haven't gone there, I strongly suggest you give it a shot. It's incredible. The view and scenery there, everything from the wildlife to the people and to the scenery, everything is just immaculate, like another planet. But due to some booking errors and issues on his end, which, he was a little neglectful in getting it done when. So we ended up going with the next best thing, Buffalo State Park, only about an hour from Yellowstone Lake. We ended up being able to make reservations for our tiny family of 4. Yeah, it wasn't Yellowstone, but it would have to do. After all, exploring other parks were still just as fun. The drive from home was roughly 2 hours. It was my father, mother, me, and my little brother. With music softly playing on the radio in the background, my father began telling us all how well off his business had been, and how he could now afford to take time off to spend with us, his family, which seemed like we were his secondary, and work, his job, was his life, his religion, his everything. And of course, all of us, we were in second place. He told us crazy stories, and even gossiped about his employees, and some strange apparent love triangles, which made us laugh a whole bunch, and some of the amazing places he had seen on business trips, and that he promised, of course, to take us there one day, whenever that one day would be, and had apparently even talked to some big-name celebrities while interviewing them for his perfume campaign. We too became engrossed in conversation as we started telling him about our lives, and before you know it, the campsite was there, right there in front of our faces. The view was breathtaking. Green grounds, everything was open, lots of forestry, little flowers and bushes, dense trees, and lots and lots and lots of greenery. It's everything you could ask for a perfect camping trip, and right along a large blue lake, hence the name of the park. This is where, right along, you could pitch your tent for camping. We were shown our camp by a nervous red-haired worker who it was probably his very first day working ever. We kept all of our belongings and things in the tent to go out and then examine the lake. We were so excited, we could hardly contain our excitement. We just wanted to go out and party and explore. Things that kids normally want to do. It was then that my brother and I decided to go for a quick dip in the lake. After all, my dad was busy setting up the tent and getting all of his fishing equipment out. By setting up the tent, he was just adding on the finishing pieces. The tent was set up, but we actually had to put the rain cover on, and I hated doing it. So my mom just sat there and took pictures of us, cheering us on while we jumped off into the lake. About an hour or two goes by, and now my brother and I are getting really, really hungry. So we get out of the lake, get our towels and dry off while laughing and joking about how silly Dad looks trying to put his fishing equipment together. My mom just finished lunch, and she made these incredible chicken sandwiches. We gobbled that down. Now our stomachs were stuffed, full of pop, and chips, and chicken sandwiches. It did not get much better than this. We were on cloud 9. As my mom got up to go let my dad know that he needs to stop tinkering around with that darn fishing rod and come eat lunch. He let out this horrendous scream that I had never heard my dad let out before, and he jumped away from the lake. But my father had caught some sort of strange fish that I'd never seen before. Have you ever seen alligator gar? Well, this looked similar, but much more terrifying, much more human-like. It ascended slowly out of the water, reaching up with its arms and grabbing hold of the fishing line, snapping it, and this strange aquatic-like face staring back at him and us as it resubmerged under the water. My mother at this point was easily beside herself, screaming, while my dad was pale. My dad just stood there, shaking, not sure what he'd caught. My brother and I just kept looking back at each other all wide-eyed, not really sure what to think. My dad just said, "I think that's enough fishing for today. What do you guys think?" And none of us really said a word. We kind of just sat around after that and played quietly. The day then turned into evening, and the evening then turned into night. After we all retired to our large tent, it was in the middle of the night that we heard something big come out of the lake and up around our campsite. My brother and I were scared, but my father and mother were fast asleep. I would whisper to my brother to make sure he was okay, and to hold my hand and stay safe. For whatever happens, we have each other. And whatever it was large. We could hear it, moving around, and every few seconds, it would kind of nudge the tent, and then stop, walk around some more, nudging the tent even more, and then stopping again, before stopping altogether. I can't believe that my brother and I had actually gotten any sleep that night. The next morning, Mom and Dad woke both of us up, saying, "Kids, we're going to leave the camp. Let's go get a hotel somewhere." My brother and I didn't bother asking any questions. We didn't really care. We were just happy to be out of that campsite and away from whatever the thing was that my dad had caught the other day, or that his line had connected to. Clearly, we had disturbed something that was under the water. The car ride out of the park to the nearest hotel was full of my parents talking very quietly to each other, keeping hard to make sure that me and my brother did not hear anything. What they were talking about, I don't know, but it really gave me a really bad feeling. But they kept reassuring my brother and I that everything was okay, and nothing was going to happen. I can't really remember much after that, but that was probably the scariest thing that's ever happened to me. I had my wedding not too long ago, and am living the most wonderful time with the love of my life. About a week before we went on our honeymoon, my soon-to-be spouse and I were staying at my parents' vacation home located in Wyoming. My mom, aunt, and several of my cousins were sitting around the fire, drinking whiskey and hot apple cider, talking about life and things they would like to do. Also, congratulating me and my now-to-be spouse about our recent marriage and all the things we would get to do. I was sitting there, playing on my Game Boy Advance, while my wife and I, at this point, had already gone to bed. She was exhausted, and turned in pretty early. As I'm sitting there, lost in my Game Boy game, I begin to hear a strange tapping on the window. A tapping sound that I could not decipher right away. The first time I heard the taps, I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe it was just my memory, or maybe my imagination. You know how sometimes you'll have faint memories pop up and that will somehow create an auditory hallucination. I thought it was maybe one of those things, but maybe I was wrong. Plus, I'm half listening in on my mom and aunt, drunkenly talking about stuff and also my game. So it was really not important. Then, I hear the tap sound again, and this time, it's much more aggressive sounding. It's gone from a tap to almost a pound. Now, it has my full attention. I think everybody else around me had heard it too, but they too were also half drunk and involved in their own conversations. They wouldn't even give the sound the time of day, kind of like how I was. In response to the pound sound, I looked out but didn't immediately see anything. My aunt, mother, and sister and I, and my cousin, all looked at me, as if I somehow had the answers. I shrugged, not really knowing what to do or how to respond. After all, I just looked out there and had not seen anything. I went back to playing my game, They went back to drunkenly conversing. That's when we heard the sound again. Although it was strange. I was right next to the window. How come I not heard it? Or at least seen it? When finally, it was movement outside the window that actually caught my attention, not the pounding. As I turned to look, 2 pale yellow eyes staring off in my direction is what sent a chill down my spine. It was hiding behind the bushes, moving, like some sort of wild animal. It's almost as if this thing had ducked down, underneath the light that was pouring out the window from inside, staying low to the ground in the bushes so I couldn't see it. I was beginning to grow very nervous. After all, after seeing it, I was already scared. My mom, aunt, sister, and cousin were completely off in their own world, drunkenly lost in conversation, just as they had been. Now, this thing had popped up right by the window, pounding on it again. And now, due to the closeness and proximity, I could see its face much more clearly. What I saw looked like a coyote or something, although it looked much more human. And now, as I stared into the face of this thing, I began to question not only my own sanity, but had I been having far too many drinks of wine myself? Maybe. This thing looked at me with a very angry expression, snarling, before ducking back down underneath the bushes in the light. I'd gotten up, excused myself, but I had to step outside for a moment to make sure what I saw was real. After all, at this point during my story, I was convinced I was hallucinating all of it. So I grabbed the flashlight we kept right next to the fridge, stepping outside the back door, turning it on, and shining it in the direction where I saw the thing. There was a whole lot of nothing and emptiness. Just the bushes. No sign that anything had even been there. It was quiet outside, but the crickets were around. I kind of let out a sigh of relief. Maybe I had dreamt it all. Maybe it really was a hallucination. I shined my light around some more, looking for any clues that would actually prove it to be real. I found nothing. So I stepped back inside, but still bothered, still very pale. After all, seeing it really did scare me. When I stepped back in, my aunt, cousin, sister, and mother all looked at me, wondering why I looked like I'd just seen an alien or a ghost. I contemplated there for a moment if I should really tell my family what I had seen, kind of thinking in my head, would they really believe me or not? So I decided what not. I told her exactly what I saw. She nodded and seemed serious. She explained to me, "Son, you've told me about that same thing you've seen when you were younger. That same coyote human face you expressed. And she even told me about the park we used to visit when I was younger. How I would see this big coyote watching me from the bushes. Although my mom never saw it, she said when I was little, I would talk about it all the time. I always called it the Coyote Man. I was so little, I don't even remember it. She never really believed me though, because I was so young. And you know how little kids tend to make up things. I figured and she figured it was one of those things. But it wasn't until one day, when I came up and I told my mom that it tried to reach out and grab me. That's when she suspected that it might be some creepy childhood predator in a suit. So we stopped going to that park altogether. Again, I have no memory of this whatsoever. I was a little guy. If this really was some sort of animal, or perhaps, dare I say, supernatural animal, could it have been following me my entire life, and have followed me all the way out here? It makes you wonder. Okay, so this just happened like last week. I live in Cody, Wyoming, and I guess my younger brother, who's about 11, decided he wanted to come and stay with me for the weekend. So, after talking to me and my parents, they determined it was okay, and same with me. My parents came and dropped him off, right about Friday. He stayed in my guest bedroom, which is right next to my bedroom. Although we're many years apart, about 11 or 12, we're still very, very close, despite the massive age gap. And so that first night, after we had a movie marathon together, the entire Fast and Furious saga, he got tired and, instead of falling asleep on the couch, like I said he could, He wanted to go sleep in a bed. I can't blame him after all. A bed is much more comfortable than a couch, and my couches weren't exactly all that great. After I helped them all get settled into bed, I took upon the rest of the night by cleaning up and just tidying up the house. After all, I didn't want it to be a pigsty. After finally getting all my cleaning done for the house, kitchen, dining room, living room, having things mopped and swept and wiped down, I decided it was time to unwind a little bit myself. So I stepped outside, smoked a joint, sat back inside and watched a few Seinfeld episodes till roughly 2 in the morning. Now, I was tired. It was time to crash. I went to my bedroom and out I went. At about 4 or so in the morning, I awake to something getting in my bed. I slowly open my eyes and see that it's my younger brother. He's pushing me aside, trying to crawl in bed. So, I'm happy to let him sleep with me. I'm assuming he must have got spooked. Even at 11, he's lucky I love him. So I didn't think much of it. I turned on my side and fell back asleep. At about 9 in the morning, we get up and start to have breakfast. So I ask him, "What made you want to crawl in bed with me last night? After all, you're 11 years old. I can only assume the guest bedroom wasn't very comfortable." He told me no, and the reason why he came in the room was because he heard something big moving around outside and in the bedroom, making these strange tapping noises. I thought that was weird. We don't have rats, and maybe it must have just been in your head. Maybe you just imagined it or had a bad dream. The remainder of that day was a blast. We watched more movies and went outside and did stuff. I tried my best to be a good big brother and keep him entertained and out of trouble. I know at school he didn't have the best influences. And as the day gave to night, he became very hesitant to want to sleep in the guest bedroom. I explained to him, "Just give it a try. If anything ever happens, you are more than welcome to come and sleep in my bedroom. I promise. Nothing is going to happen to you." He seemed comforted by this fact and agreed. But then a smile crept across his face. And this kid, man, my brother can easily be a barterer. He makes really good deals. He sits there trying to talk to me and barter with me that why don't I sleep in the bed with him, so that way I could see what he's talking about. I figured why not? What have I got to lose? So it was settled. We did the same thing as the night before. Watched a bunch of movies until about 10:30 at 11 p.m. We decided to crawl into bed together. I think we lay there, quietly talking about just stuff about life, when around midnight, we had both fallen asleep from exhaustion. It was maybe a couple of hours later we both woke up, to the sound of knocking on the walls. And I'd asked my brother if he had heard what I just heard. He told me no. This time, he turned over on his side, falling fast back asleep. And now I was left there, wide-eyed. I knew I had just heard the knocks that he had talked about. I wasn't crazy. There it is again. I'd heard the knocks, but my brother was now asleep. Instead of shaking him to wake him up and have him experience this with me, I decided to get up and get down to the bottom of this. I could not make out where the knocks were coming from. They sounded like they were coming from everywhere, above and below. So as soon as it happened, I knocked back hard, swearing. The knocks stopped momentarily, before continuing again, even louder and more abrasive this time. I pounded the walls now, determined to make the noises stop, when I see this light coming outside the window, coming towards the window, and I turned. It was this fully illuminated figure in this blue light. Think like a fully white translucent being, except glowing, and it walks up to the window and lifts up its hand and does this twirling thing with its hand, and my entire body is now locked, almost like extreme paralysis. I have no control over what I'm doing except moving my eyes, and this thing turns my body like a puppeteer to a puppet to face the window. And now I'm completely terrified by whatever entity or demon or being this thing is. I can only assume it's an alien. And I know you probably won't believe this, but whatever this entity was began telepathically speaking to me in a voice that I could not begin to describe to you, but I could just tell it was speaking to me. And it warned me that the house I was living in now was going to burn down in 7 months, and if I did not leave, I too would be consumed in the fire and my life would be lost. You can imagine I was so petrified, I'm surprised I didn't destroy my pants. But after a few more moments of all this going on, it slowly drifted away from the window, the blue light fading away with it, and my body regained its movement and strength. I decided against waking up my brother or telling him what I'd just seen. That would probably scare the living heck out of him. So I just returned to my room and paced all night long, trying to comprehend what just happened. I was convinced somebody had slipped me some acid, but it was all far too real and terrifying for any of that to be the case. But I did my best to prove how brave I was, at least to my little brother. The next day was Sunday, and it was time for Mom and Dad to come pick him up, which they did. He had a really fun time. We said our goodbyes. Now for the following week, I never heard any more tapping or had any more visits from whatever it was, but I felt very on edge, like something could happen at any moment, and I could not stop thinking about the warning it gave me, which is really funny because fast forward a few months later, and I had completely forgotten about it, completely left it out of my life, like some sort of bad memory that my brain had tried to erase. This was in March, by the way. So now we're going to fast forward to about June. I get a call from a friend who lives a state away. He just got a job from a friend of his, working on unloading trucks, but the pay was really good, and I was kind of in between jobs at that moment. I could have really used a good paycheck, so I thought, what the heck, why not? I'd get to be working with one of my close buddies who moved a long time ago. I took him up on the offer, selling that little house I lived in and going to go roommate with my buddy. So again, the first event happened in March. This was now in June. Come to find out, much later on, November I think it was, that small house I had actually lived in during the time of this event had actually burned down just as an entity had predicted and warned. Thank God Almighty I was not living in the house at the time. It was actually vacant. But apparently there had been some sort of gas leak or something. I don't remember what I was told. But somehow, it had caught fire and fully consumed itself. There was nothing left. It's something that when I think back to, really gives me the creeps. To know that this unknown entity reached out to me to warn me about an all-consuming fire. Maybe it was luck or fate that my friend had reached out once I'd forgotten about it. Because had I not got that call, I'd probably still be living there, job hopping. Who knows if I would have been caught up in that fire and I'd be dead. My name's Devin. I'm a pretty ordinary guy. I'm a shelf stalker at a rather larger company. And this day, I'd gone with my family to go camping at Yellowstone National Park. This was about 7 months ago. I was with my wife Sarah, my son Matt, and my youngest daughter Melissa. This was the very first time we were ever going to be venturing into Yellowstone. We were very excited. Our plan was to take a bunch of pictures of animals, because I hear they have all sorts of things like grizzly bears and moose and elk, all just roaming around the park. Even wolves. It's quite the adventure. Which also means if you're going to be camping, you have to be careful. We got there pretty early, just as daylight was breaking. It was roughly 4:30 in the morning. My wife was as ecstatic as ever, and my son and daughter, well, they were struggling to keep awake. I can't blame them. Of course, because we were so early, we could not get into the park yet. However, we felt like something was watching us, which was strange, but we didn't think much of it. After all, we are on a massive wildlife preserve. There's bear and all sorts of other critters around here, so we figured maybe something was just watching us from the distance, like a larger animal. But when I asked my wife Sarah about this, she recalls it feeling much more ominous. However, all that was so well worth it once the sun began to rise and give life and light to everything around us. The trees lit up, the mountains, everything around us turned into this incredible scenery that you just have to be there to know. It was glorious. The rest of that day was packed with all sorts of activities. In the morning, once we were finally able to get in and set up our camp, we tried to go and take some pictures of wild animals, exploring, hiking around a little bit. In the afternoon, we went and checked out some of the lakes and rivers. The water was pretty cold. As evening, we then started roasting marshmallows and telling stories over the fire. It was the perfect way to end an almost perfect day. And we were all pretty tired from traveling. I think we were so overexcited and overstimulated, there wasn't much shutting down after that. At one point, Matt and Melissa both fell asleep. We helped them go back to the tent, and they were out. Now, it was just time for me and Sarah to have a little bit of romance by the fire. We were snuggling and just talking about things that adults talk about, and other inappropriate conversations. You could see where I'm going with this. I also need to mention that the campsite we were at, the campsites around us, there was nobody, so we were kind of tucked into our own little corner, which was really nice. Something I always preferred when camping because it gives you the utmost privacy. I mean, who could ask for more? My least favorite part about camping was always being a stone's throw away from the next campsite over. Then you have to hear all their conversations and all their racket. It's never much fun, and doesn't really make much sense for traditional camping, am I right? But that was not the case this night. So, we figured, since we had this little corner all the way to ourselves, we could be a little more private and discreet, as Sarah and I began to discuss plans to do things. But that soon was cut off when we heard a loud crashing in the woods near us. Now, when I say crashing, what I'm actually referring to is it sounded like a damn fir tree falling over in the forest. It was loud. And in the process of that noise, it woke both Matt and Melissa. They both came out of the tent, very scared. It was like a darn bolt of lightning coming down, crashing into the forest. But yet, there was no rain, there was no thunder, nothing. So, the fact that it was lightning was impossible. We would have seen it, and with how close it was, you would have known. Something big knocked it over. With all of this going on, you bet I was incredibly concerned. So, I thought the next best thing was to go and contact a ranger and find out what we can get from them. I made my way down the path near the nearest station, where there was an overnight ranger there. I explained to him what we had heard, and that we were very concerned. But as I'm explaining this to him, the look on his face is that of terror, and he stops me, grabs his gun, and tells me he's going to go check it out right now. Well, his behavior certainly wasn't comforting in any way, so we see him get into his Jeep and drive off and down in the direction we heard the noise. I'm beginning to feel a little worried, because not long later, I noticed the forest around us goes quiet. The night was alive with a chorus of crickets, something that was very, very loud, but now it was quiet all of a sudden. It's here in June. There's no reason that this noise should have been this quiet. The forest and everything around us should have been this quiet. Nothing made sense, and out of nowhere, we hear the man scream bloody murder, followed by several gunshots. At this point, we knew danger was amiss. I think it was about time to wrap up our camping trip right then and there. I don't know what the heavy thudding was that we had heard, or the massive tree falling, or why the ranger felt the need to scream and fire his gun off at something. But whatever it was, I think it was more than a grizzly bear. We did not want to stick around to find out. We put out the fire, and my wife and kids were pretty much in agreement with me that we needed to leave now. So we quickly packed everything up, we got in our car, and we drove out of there. I wasn't sure what to do. Sarah kept begging me, "You need to call somebody. You need to tell somebody something's happened to that man." So I had called the main ranger station and let them know. They sounded very nonchalant about it, like they didn't really believe me. The one ranger whom I spoke to over the phone questioned how much I had been drinking. And this is when I lost my temper and got angry, explaining to him exactly what we had experienced and what we had heard, and that you have a ranger possibly hurt that you need to go check out now. He then asked me if I was threatening him, but thankfully they decided to pull their heads out of their butts and get it taken care of. The experience was pretty traumatic for my wife and family. I always thought Yellowstone was supposed to be a peaceful adventure, but instead, it turned into this nightmare. I know grizzlies are big and so are moose, and they could do things, but I don't know. Just something did not feel right about that night and that large crashing sound that we had heard. I had nothing but bad feelings about it. And if you plan on going to Yellowstone, I would advise you to be safe. I live here in Cheyenne, Wyoming. I've lived here pretty much my whole life. Wyoming is a state known for its vast wilderness, and of course Yellowstone. With the low population and all the great outdoors, it's a great place to get away from regular life. My friends and I are huge outdoor enthusiasts, and we love to hike, camp, fish, all the usual stuff. As a matter of fact, as of last summer, my friends and I had decided to take a trip to Mount Washburn. None of us had been there before, and we figured why not? It would be the perfect little getaway. It's only an 8-kilometer walk from the Chittenden Road parking area trailhead. Our plan was simple, to go there for just one weekend. We would go there and stay during the night, then come back tomorrow night. It's a nice way to kind of clear your mind and get some fresh air. Being out in nature is always perfect, and it seems like it treats you perfectly. Now, our plan was quite simple. We wanted to get there as early as possible. This way, we would have the entire day and night to explore, hang out, and do whatever we wanted. That was the plan. When we got there, we did not realize how gorgeous the mountain was. We began taking a lot of pictures, enjoying all the serene beauty around us. We had also brought a ton of whiskey, bourbon, and vodka. We were planning to get pretty trashed. We felt like we had needed it. A good night of getting drunk to kind of reset our batteries. My friend Luca actually brought along his girlfriend. They were in the midst of trying to set me up with one of their friends, Kira, so they had invited her too. And also, my brother Michael had came along with us as well. So yeah, it was going to be a pretty fun outing. We were pretty much walking and exploring the place the entire day, and by the time it became dark, we were pretty tired, but decided the party must commence. So the night itself is going fantastic. We're all drinking, and we're all feeling pretty buzzed. Kira and I are having a wonderful time getting to know each other, enjoying each other's company and the company of our friends, and a warm, toasty fire, surrounded by perfect, beautiful nature. I couldn't ask for a better hangout, honestly. And so finally, about 11 p.m., midnight came. We were all pretty tipsy. I don't think any of us were really drunk, because we had been slowly consuming alcohol, or at least had drained down enough to where we were just tipsy at this point. We got the bright idea to go and explore a little more, during the dark, see the mountain in a whole new light, or in this case, dark. So, we set off, hiking and joking around, talking about all sorts of random stuff. We probably spent a good 30 minutes, maybe 45 minutes out there, just wandering around, having fun, laughing, joking, and talking about stuff. And finally, we were on our way back to camp, and we saw this cave, maybe about 50 or so meters away, give or take, and we thought it'd be fun to go and explore. We didn't care that we didn't really have any flashlights or any gear to go and explore it properly. We were just hungry for adventure. As we approached it, we realized it was not a cave opening at all, but merely part of the rock formation and the way the shadows had laid on it, due to the moonlight. We were all pretty disappointed, deciding it was best to just head back to camp and let the night take its toll on us. As we started walking back, we all thought we heard it, which was later proved to be true. Footsteps. Someone was following us. Mind you, that during this time, everything and everybody around us was very quiet. There were campsites off in the distance, but it was pretty much just us. Even the wind seemed dead tonight. It was very creepy. We thought we wanted to go back and see if somebody was truly following us. After all, there were 5 of us, nothing to be scared of. So we headed back in the direction we thought we had heard somebody following us, which is right by where we had thought the cave was. Well, right there is a small road, and right by the road, where we had heard the noises, were 2 large imprints. The ground in which they were imprinted in was very soft, so the outline of the footprint was very, very clear, and the indent was massive, along with the sheer size. We all speculated it could have been a Bigfoot, which creeped us out, so we quickly headed back to camp, shutting down our alcohol bonanza for the night, crashing out in our tents. The next morning we got up and decided to go investigate. We had traveled back to the exact same spot where the footprints were. However, It looked like they were gone, as if something had came by and tried to swipe the footprints out to make sure they're not there anymore. It was weird, and we got a really bad, creepy feeling about it. Again, we all speculated that it could have been a Bigfoot. None of us were even believers, but now we were definitely thinking differently. I believe that to this day, Bigfoot is a very real possibility, and maybe he was watching us and stalking us, waiting for the right opportunity to attack us. Maybe not. Maybe he was just curious at a bunch of half-drunken kids walking around, making random fart noises and jokes in the forest. Either way, it was too creepy for me. But I guess as long as we're all in one piece, that's what counts, right? Back in 2019, I moved here, to the beautiful state of Wyoming. I'm originally from Chicago, so the change in scenery and temperature is definitely different for me. I moved in a job transfer, and have since made some new friends who are always trying to get me to go on random exhibitions with them, and have never got the chance until recently, when I went with them to go to the Grand Teton National Forest. It seemed like the perfect opportunity to go and see the state a little bit more, get a breath of fresh air, and hang out with good company. But it's more what I saw that day that has now forever changed my mind about what I think is in the park and what I want to explore. In fact, after this, I'll probably really never going exploring again, but that's a story for a different day, because I could give you all my reasons why. But today, I'm going to tell you the story about what happened. So, we had already been at the park all day long, and now we were heading back. The sun was beginning to set. It was time to wrap things up. So, as we're getting to the car, we're going through a large field that has very tall grass in it. Wyoming is known for its incredibly vast and interesting wildlife. And whatever was in this tall grass was very, very large. And it was moving very quickly, not to us, but parallel with us to the road, as well as we were. We got in the car, and before we could even turn the engine on, we see something, what was following us in the grass, come out across the road, disappearing into the other side. We all speculate that it was a deer. We saw horns, but it was white, while also being very large. This was, of course, until we got a little bit closer by this thing coming out of the grass again. And although I didn't see it as good as they did, they told me to floor the car and to go now, that we were being stalked by the jack howler. I'd asked them, what's a jack howler? They explained that it's this large white creature with horns that devours people. Something that people from Wyoming state are supposed to know about, but only think of it as a folklore legend and not real. While I did see something that was white, I didn't exactly see a jack howler, but it was scary nonetheless. We drove out of there and I didn't ask any more questions. When I was about 15 years of age, I lived with my grandparents who were in Wyoming. They were in their 90s and were not near equipped to deal with a rambunctious teenager like me that had a penchant for climbing out of windows. Most nights I'd slip out and find ways to drink near my weight in stolen booze and alcohol. But, more often than not, I was finding more ways to get myself in trouble. This particular stunt we were about to pull seemed pretty genius at the time. We were equipped of wads of stolen cash, fake IDs, and a box of stolen condoms, snatched from a dented box at the come and go. Our destination was about an hour away, to explore the city life and try and get into some of the clubs. Things turned crazy, because the driver decided to lick his finger and shove it in my ear. I then punched him in the throat, angry that he was still giving me a wet willy. He got pissed and got out of the car, leaving us on the side of the road. He told us we were responsible for getting back. Good luck. After many failed attempts at trying to flag somebody down, we were beginning to feel hopeless, like we were going to be stuck there for a very long time. Now we were pissed and arguing amongst ourselves how we were going to get back. I guess we had no way but to walk and leave the car. Still arguing how we had been looking forward to this outing all week long, and now it was completely ruined. And so there we were, a few young men, walking by ourselves down the Wyoming interstate, still pissed off that we were in this predicament. To our left was a large hill, and of course Brentley somehow tripped on a root, falling down the hill, rolling. We called out to him, but he was not responding back. At first, his humiliation was much needed, and quite funny, but after he disappeared into the brush and was not calling back to us, we began to get really worried. Now we were calling back to him, wanting to know that he was okay. So me and Chad played rock, paper, scissors to see who would go down there and try to find where he was. It was dark out, so the only real light we had was the light that our phone lights had given us. At the end of this stupid game, we decided we should both go down there and make sure he's okay. The way down was pretty steep, a lot of brush and thick roots, and there was a small stream right where he had fallen. But there was no sign he had fallen anywhere. There was no movement or anything we could tell that he had come down here. No blood on the tree stump. Nothing. So we tried to look around for more signs, figuring he maybe just climbed himself out of the stream and went the opposite direction. But we could not see that. We began to panic and decided it was in our best case scenario to call the authorities and have them help us search for him. After all, if he did die, the blood was not going to be on my hands. I was not going to be responsible for my friend's death. Brent, after all, was notorious for having the energy of a dying cat, often going completely silent when something was amiss. And the quieter he stayed, the louder my heart pounded. I was beginning to be very scared. I wasn't sure what was going to happen. After all, this was a very dangerous scenario that we had been placed in, and our plans foiled. What were we going to do? Doesn't it look like he was dragged? Chad wasn't as funny as he thought he was, and I ignored his efforts to get a rise out of me outright. I was not going to play his games. Not now. Not in this crisis of a situation. It didn't make sense anyway. As I've said already, there was no blood, and we were walking over stone. Surely there would have been a sign. If he thought I was stupid enough to believe him, despite the conditions, then that was his problem. I was not going to deal with it. Seriously, he'd pushed. His hand had come down hard on my shoulder as he turned his cell phone light to the brightest, shining it again, forcing me to look where he wanted to. And I hate to admit it, because Chad was likely pranking me, but the way the dirt had settled was too suspicious to ignore. Something was awry here. Things were not right. Things did not look right. Honestly, it looked as if somebody had dragged him deep into the darkness by the ankles through the dust and gravel. We could not believe what we were seeing. It seemed so unlikely that something like this would take place. I mean, there were no footprints to follow, no noise to help us gauge the threat level. But Chad was chasing the trail without a second thought, running into the dark, screaming at the unknown to leave our friend alone, as if he or it had not already contented itself with murder, as if it would hesitate to add us to its Friday night plans. I tried calling him back, but in the end, the only choice was to follow him into the dark, face first, into something horrific. There was no shortage of blood on this side of the rock. It soaked into my tennis shoes and burned my nose with this weird metallic-y smell. If you've ever smelt blood in a large amount, you'll know what I'm talking about. For example, just go to any butcher shop or go to any part where they're processing a lot of raw meat. You'll know exactly what the smell is. It's unmistakable. A strong, rusty, irony smell. It stinks. Maybe you are used to it. I saw Chad's phone lying on the ground, flashlight side down, and the only sound was a shaky, piteous kind of gasping that told me one thing, and one thing only. And if that sound, that desperate and unforgettable rattle, did not convince me how it did, the thing standing in the stream of yellow light coming from my flashlight certainly provided me all the answers I would need to come to the appropriate conclusion. Its face was covered in long, matted fur. The only holes in that impenetrable mat were the eyes. Eyes like a serpent, or like that of a snake, sneering back at me, emotionless, dead and cold. They almost glowed this ominous yellow, like it wanted my soul. I had no time to try and decipher as I had ran for the hill that I had previously come down. I could see the authorities had now arrived, due to the blue lights up ahead. I screamed for the police to help me, to come save me from this thing that I had seen. Although everything was going so fast, in my mind, there was no real time to process everything. It was just get out now, fight or flight. When they went down there, they had found Chad's phone, but there was no signs of blood or foul play, no body, and we were accused of playing pranks on the police and charged accordingly, completely wasting their time. And to say we got in trouble for this was a massive understatement. You see, my grandparents were so pissed, they sent me back to Texas the next month, leaving me to brave the foster care system. They were that cold. I didn't blame them, not exactly. They were not exactly equipped to handle my shenanigans. The next month, leading up to me being surrendered, I'd become overwhelmed by nightmares. Those same yellow eyes, those serpent eyes haunted me nightly, burning their way into my nightmares, my dreams, even my day, into my skull, beating against my psyche until I could not take any more. It was as if to assure me that it would always be with me, that I was now marked. I'm just glad I never had to see that thing again, because there's no telling what it could have been or what it was, other than maybe acknowledging it was a demon. And honestly, when my grandparents told me that they'd be surrendering me, I was as happy as ever. I could care less. Even now, 15 years later, now that I'm 32, I still feel like I shouldn't have escaped, like it wanted me to. Maybe, just maybe it wanted me to go, so it could haunt me and torment me for the remainder of my days. And I can't help but think back, whatever happened to my friend. He was kind of a nobody, a nomad. He didn't really have parents. And recalling back, I can't remember who he went with, because you would think, how would people not notice a teenage boy who just went missing? But to my knowledge, there were no police reports ever filed or no missing reports ever made. He was just gone, and that was it. Do I believe he was killed and eaten by this creature? Yes I do. And this story for me is easily one of the most frightening and terrifying experiences of my entire life. So, this story that I'm about to tell you is going to take place here in Wyoming, in the Yellowstone National Park to be precise. 5 years ago, I had moved to Germany, to Gardner, in Montana. I want to apologize to you in advance. I still make a lot of mistakes in English, so forgive me. I had dreamt of moving to the United States for years, and finally, the opportunity came before I could take the huge step. For anybody, coming from another country to the United States is a very big jump, not just in culture, but in life, finances, and just adjusting. After all, the United States is still the best country in the world. I stand by that. Anyway, I wanted to move somewhere with a lot of beautiful nature, and I found that in Montana. Most people are really nice here, always willing to help. That's something I did not feel often when I was living in Germany. It's a different culture there, a different time. So, here, I made a lot of new friends. A lot of them enjoyed hiking and camping pretty often. You know, the outdoorsy type. I'm ashamed to say that I never did these things back in Germany. Germany does have its handful of amazing sceneries and beautiful parts in nature. I was just never really one to explore them. My friends felt like they had to introduce me to camping, and so we started this thing where we would go on camping trips every now and then, as often as our schedules would permit. When we had the time to, we would always make it a priority. My work was pretty easy to manage. See, I was a freelance translator for a large company, whose name I won't mention, so my schedule was very flexible. The others did not have that same privilege. This meant that different people came along on different camping trips. I had several groups of friends, many of them very interested in my German heritage and the German language. One day, about 4 years ago, we had decided to go camping in the Yellowstone National Park. It was here we had made the choice to stay at Norris Campground. It was supposedly one of the calmest and most amazing campgrounds there were. My friends were the one that did their research and due diligence, so I trusted their judgment. It was about a 1-hour drive from Gardner, so it wasn't too bad. We were traveling in my friend's RV, just the four of us. We were all so excited for this trip. He had one of those old 90s Winnebagos, so it was perfect for traveling in, and it made the trip even more special. I had never visited Yellowstone Park, but had heard all about it and had seen many of the amazing postcards and pictures of Yellowstone. If you're out of the country and you hear about Yellowstone, it's a park that a lot of people rave about. I think, coming from a foreigner, Yellowstone is probably the biggest, most famous national park in the entire country. So you can imagine my containment of excitement when learning this is where we were going. Not to mention all the wildlife and animals we were going to see. It was going to be like it was from another place. And on the way there, my friends were telling me about some amazing stories they had while they were camping there. Everything from rock climbing to caving and exploring. The others had visited the park, but were just as excited as I was to go back. It was really cold at this time, very chilly. We had packed a lot of warm clothes and blankets to make sure we would stay as warm as possible all throughout the nights. The temperature drops down, so you want to be careful not to get frostbite. When we arrived at the campsite, it was now later in the afternoon, as we had left way too late. Not that it mattered too much. Worst came to worse, we had an RV. Our plan was to just go and eat our food, play a game around the campfire, and go to sleep. Even though we had an RV, we planned a tent camp. We slept in tents, 2 people to a tent. Staying by yourself isn't safe, so we figured having a tent buddy was the best way to go about it. Nothing strange happened that first night. We all fell fast asleep, even though we hadn't really done anything exhausting all day. But you know how travel days can be. The stimulation, the excitement, and just staring at an ongoing road forever, it can be tiring. And then getting to a new place and adjusting, it was tiring. We decided to wake up early to start our hike early, before anybody else around us. It was a great decision that I look back on and will do so again in future exhibitions. We weren't the only ones who had decided to start early, but there weren't that many people overall. We would then return to our campsite in the afternoon to have a nice lunch and dinner and play some more card games again. The hike went over pretty quickly, and we were actually really tired this time, so returning early had been a great idea. All the amazing stuff we got to see. It was well worth it, and each time we went on a hike, it was just as exciting as it were when we were driving there. I could hardly contain myself. Being in this park was incredible, and we tried to go on as many trailheads as we could. There are many in Yellowstone, and I knew it was impossible for us to do all of them, so we just tried to do what we could in the daytime. When we had gotten back and played card games, we were now done with eating dinner. We didn't feel like playing any more card games, so we just sat around the fire, telling scary stories and just having fun, recalling old fond memories, asking me about my German past. But then, they started to talk about really scary stories, ones that happened right here in the same park. I'm not really that sensitive to scary stories, but the girlfriend who slept with me in my tent, she got pretty scared pretty easily by stories about ghosts and goblins. She believed in the paranormal, and even supernatural beings. She didn't really mind those. It was the true crime stories that really got to her. Every psychopath and serial killer, it really struck a nerve with her. When our stories turned from the paranormal to serial killer, it really got her bothered. I could tell. She was all of a sudden acting really tired and telling us she had wanted to go to sleep. I decided to go with her. She probably wouldn't feel safe by herself, and it was the nice friend thing to do. That night, I fell asleep really fast once again. I woke up to my friend grabbing my hand. When I turned around to look at her, I could tell she was really freaking out now. Panicking, actually. She had completely covered herself with the blankets that we had brought us, on top of her sleeping bag, only leaving a small gap for her eyes and mouth. She was shaking, trembling actually, and breathing heavily. And before I could begin to even mouth what was wrong, she very quickly pointed a finger up, towards the top of the tent, and put a finger to her mouth at the same time, telling me to be quiet. I wasn't even sure what was going on myself when I slowly turned on my back to look up, and I was shocked by what I saw. Standing over our tent was what appeared to be the silhouette of a very, very large man. He was towering over us, and it looked as if he was staring down at us. I completely froze and noticed that I was breathing heavily myself. I couldn't move. Every part of my body was as if you had just dunked me in an ice-cold lake. Every limb was frozen, and even my breathing was labored. I grabbed my friend's hand and squeezed it as tightly as I could, not only to calm her down, but also myself. Now, I wasn't doing any better than she was. And something I noticed right away about this tall man that was not right is the shape. Yes, he was large, but his head was kind of cone-shaped, and I didn't see much of a neck. And he was built like a bodybuilder. I was convinced this was the end. He was going to tear our tent open and stab us to death, like the Zodiac killer. I've said this before. I don't really scare easily, but in this situation, I was really freaked out. I tried holding my breath for a little while when, all of a sudden, the person began to slowly move. He was no longer towering over our tent, but was now moving towards the entrance to our tent, very cautiously and very slowly, almost kind of like tiptoeing, in a way to keep silent. It or he was trying their best to be sly. My tent was completely zipped up, luckily. My biggest fear would be him opening up our tent, and we had no weapons to protect ourselves, other than screaming, which I doubt here would get us very far. I'm not a religious person, but at that point, I was praying for that not to happen. My heart dropped when I heard the zipper being tugged on and pulled. My friend and I exchanged one more look before shutting our eyes and squeezing them. I felt something moving right above my leg, like a hand, and my entire body completely tensed up. But the hand disappeared, and I was scared that this person was going to suddenly grab onto my ankles and rip me out of the tent. Instead, that did not happen, but something else that set me on edge. There was a loud scream. My friend was screaming her lungs out, and I heard something big running away from us, its footsteps thudding very heavily, as if it had weighed considerable amount. I opened my eyes and saw this figure running away. My friend was now crying. She was horrified, and so was I, to be honest. We woke up our other two friends and explained to them what had happened. I guess they had been sound asleep the entire time, and they had no idea. We were both in tears at this point, so scared. What really disturbs me is the direction the man ran off to was thick woods, and if we looked down at the ground where he walked from, he had also come from woods, and while there wasn't exactly footprints, we could tell that his marks in the dirt, he was huge, and moved very quickly, like inhumanly quick. Once my friends saw this too, it really creeped them out and reassured that me and my friend were telling the truth. Safe to say that we just slept in the RV that night, before leaving to go back home the next morning. The incident had left me traumatized and never wanting me to go back to Yellowstone. I just don't understand why this happened. I think it could have ended badly, had it or he got into the tent. Last year, 3 of my friends and I gathered together to go on a field camping trip to Yellowstone National Park. To say we were excited was a vast understatement. When I say that we live in Wyoming, people always think that Yellowstone is practically in our neighborhood, but they are very wrong. In fact, Yellowstone National Park isn't even up in most of the state. It's actually over in the northwestern section. It's like those same people who think Seattle pretty much covers the entire state of Washington and forget about all the other beautiful places of the Pacific Northwest. I mean, don't get me wrong, Wyoming is a huge state, and I think it's a 10th on the list by total size. Me and my friends are actually from Cheyenne, and so making a trip to Yellowstone is quite the endeavor. It requires a lot of planning and a lot of putting things in logistical order. Our plan wasn't too complicated. We just wanted to go for a night and come back, which seems kind of silly in hindsight looking back at it, why we would travel all this way for just a single night, but it's all we could afford, and it's all we had wanted. Well, the day of the trip had arrived, and we packed all of our stuff, heading straight to Yellowstone. It had been a rather long drive, but it went by pretty quick. We were all pretty well rested, thank goodness. I'm not always used to getting a good night of sleep, but this night, I must have been so excited, I somehow let my body go into a sleep coma. I remember being quite talkative during the trip. Maybe it was the monster I was drinking. We spent the day hiking around once we got there, all around the tourist-designated areas. There's some beautiful waterfalls and springs, and the sun was out and glorious. Now, as we were getting back into our car, heading for the nearest campsite, and as the sun was setting, it was supposed to be a shorter drive, but ended up being a bit longer. So we sat in the car and decided to just chill out for a little while, relax and rest. After all, it was a very eventful day for all of us. After about an hour or so, we continued on our trip, and now it was already night. The moon was full and shined very brightly. We could see everything quite well. When the moon is illuminated that brightly, you can see just about everything. It's quite nice. The roads can sometimes get boring though, because there's just so much tree coverage and foliage that you can't always see a lot. The trees aren't necessarily big, and don't make me think quite of a thick forest. That's just how pine trees are, the nature of fir trees. And as we were calming down, we were driving slowly. One of the friends was already asleep. I was sitting on the front passenger seat, just kind of gazing off into the distance, lost in my own thoughts. And then I saw something rather peculiar. I could have sworn that a large tree had just moved in the distance, but that would be crazy. At first, maybe somebody was illegally felling a tree. I mean, it wouldn't be impossible. People can do it, but would they get caught is another question. In just another moment, I saw another tree move next to it. Okay, I told my friend to slow down. I now needed to get a better look. Something was up, and I needed to know what. Then, another tree near us moved again. Now I knew something was definitely up, but I was going to figure out what. But this movement was much closer to the road, and all of us could see it happening clearly. Even the sound of wood cracking and breaking as the trees collided with other trees. All three of us that were awake looked at each other, in confusement and puzzlement on our faces. I was the very first one to spot something moving between the tree line. A large silhouette, moving towards the road. We were already scared enough. This area is populated by big bears, and we wanted to get out now. And right then, one of the most bizarre things happened, leaving us completely speechless. The creature slowed down as it got closer to the road, ahead of us, and then stopping completely. You could tell it was looking in our direction, slowly rising up from a bent-over position, standing upright, erect on two legs. If I had to guess, I would say it was easily over 7 feet tall now, and it began to walk slowly, step by step in our direction, like it was about to charge the car. Whatever the thing was, it was not a bear, if you've ever seen one. It was huge, very hairy all over its body, and its body parts were very long and strong. It looked very muscular. It looked like somebody took a very large gorilla, gave it steroids. We'd all heard stories of Sasquatch, but this thing looked even bigger, scarier and more dangerous. And the expression on its face did not look too happy that we were seeing it. The friend that was driving finally had snapped out of his shock state, slamming the gas pedal, and began reversing the vehicle to head back the direction we had come. I kept my eyes directly on this monster, and it wasn't happy that we had wanted to leave. We were now facing the opposite direction of it, and I could still see it through the back window, and how now it was moving towards us, lumbering and moving slowly, but picking up momentum and speed. It started running on two legs, but as it began to gain speed and momentum, it started to gradually move down on all fours, sprinting directly at the car. and not running at us like a gorilla would, but running at us like a wolf or a large animal would, who is naturally on all fours. We were terrified. We now were also gaining speed slowly, and just as the thing was about to reach the vehicle, we accelerated faster than it. It didn't want to give up so easily. Now, it was still charging at us full speed, smacking onto the ground loudly, and we could hear its every step from the car. We got further and further away from it, and in the next minute, it had disappeared completely out of sight. We could not hear it either. Just in case, my friend kept speeding like crazy for the next couple of minutes, just so this thing did not get the chance to catch up to us, or hope it wouldn't. We were right outside the park at this point, so believe me, we weren't driving around like crazy inside the park. But we still had a good 10 hours to go until we could even get home. 10 very slow, agonizing hours, with fear the entire time that this creature was going to come barreling out of the woods right at our vehicle, stop our car, rip all of us out of the car, and tear us limb from limb. Fortunately, that did not happen. But what I can say is I will never forget the odor and sight of this terrifying, strong-looking creature. We were lucky that night. Lucky we had escaped. There's no telling what it would have done, and now I don't even necessarily feel safe going outdoors or doing outdoor-related activities. That includes being out in the forest. We got lucky, as I said. Had that thing caught us on foot, I can't say for sure that we'd still be here to retell the story. Now, do I believe in Bigfoot or Sasquatch? I still don't know, because I honestly can't tell you what it was we saw that night. I want to believe, but I think it was a monster. I don't think Bigfoot would do something like that. Whatever it was, it certainly did not like us around, which is why I believe that it chased us away. I was staying at the Grand Teton Park in Wyoming. This was just for a weekend trip with the family. It was the very first time we had ever went on a trip in years, actually. Mainly because my parents are so busy with work and life and family, you know how things can be. Life just sort of gets away from you. The trip was definitely unforgettable, besides the breathtaking view, all the amazing scenery, and all the fun memories. However, the thing that made the trip unforgettable was the creature we saw. I can't quite explain it. Not just me, the whole family. It was an experience that would be so vivid, and would now stay in my mind for a very long time. Even now thinking back to it, it's still ingrained. So, my family had went to go to the Grand Teton National Park over the weekend for the family activity thing. Usually, we would just eat outside or visit some relative on the weekend if we were not too busy. But this week, my brother had suggested a trip, and our parents surprisingly agreed. Somehow, after checking their busy schedules, they found time for it. They were free. Fast forward, we are driving on Jenny Lake Road. The road is very open, and there are very few vehicles also on the road, which is nice. I hate lots of traffic and congestion. It's much more freeing when you're the only car on the road, and you can look around you, look at all the trees and nature, and not be bothered by seeing passing hunks of metal. The weather was also quite cloudy. A lot of overcast, but it didn't quite look like it would rain. There are clouds that they look very dark when it's about to rain, and this was not then. My dad and mom are at the front, while my brother and I are sitting in the back. Anyway, as we're driving, we suddenly see this brownish creature almost kind of galloping, a few meters away from us on the roadside. I say brownish because it looked far more brown at some point, but it was also kind of gray. Now, there were trees, but some part of the roadside was just plain grassy. I knew it was a strange creature that I'd never seen, even from afar. I thought it was maybe a deer or a horse, but it looked different. I quickly pointed it out to my brother, and he also saw it. I didn't mind it that much since it was not the first time I had seen a horse, or a deer. I watched it as we drove. It was running the same direction as us. A couple of seconds later, another one came out of nowhere, and appeared right behind the one I'm looking at. I was in shock. I mean, I've seen the horse alone before, or a deer, and then suddenly there was another one. I thought honestly it might have just been the angle, so we kept watching them, and out of nowhere, two more appeared. It was sudden, and they kind of startled me and my parents. We were a little unnerved at what we were seeing. While they kind of looked somewhat like deer, they looked also very, very different from any other creature or animal we'd ever seen before. While like deer, they were all white, having large horns that kind of curved and moved upward. Their eyes were strange. They looked very weird, almost like some sort of alien deer or something strange like that. However, they were clearly a herd or maybe some sort of strange deer that had been worked on. I know it sounds a little science fiction-y here, but I don't know what else to think. In unison, all four moved together, going back into the tree line, where they disappeared for good. My family's really not sure what conclusion to come to. We've all argued about it before and tried to come to our own conclusions of what we thought they could be. But we all four saw it, all four of them. There's clearly a species of creatures living out here in Wyoming that nobody else seems to know about or talk about. I've even tried to research it and find out things, but there's nothing. Maybe when I get a moment, I'll have to sit down and draw you an illustration. Although crude, I'll do my best to try and draw what we saw. This is a night that I'll never quite forget. It is ingrained in me now. It was on a Saturday night. Me and a couple of buddies of mine were hanging out by this public park in Medicine Bow, located in Carbon County, Wyoming. Now, at this point, it was already past 10, and we snuck inside here to hang out. We do this often, since this was a place close by our house. It was quiet, and most of all, we could horse around as much as we want, without having to disturb others. It was supposed to be just like any other Saturday night. We were all by the slide, and across was the trees. We're goofing around and talking, mainly talking about the girls we wanted to date, and we heard this strange noise coming from the trees. We were joking, thinking it was some sort of monster that was going to get us. We told each other to shut up and to listen. Maybe we thought it was a squirrel. We didn't mind and just continued on with our business and horsing around. Well, a few seconds later, the same sound was heard again, but this time it came from a nearby tree. And again, we thought it was a squirrel. My friend got curious and shined his light on the tree, using his phone to see what was going on. The light illuminated something that looked like a strange little human. It was green, dark in color, and had these hideous red eyes and a mouthful of teeth. Its back was facing us, but its head turned quickly, responding, reacting to the light now shining on it. The creature also had slits in its eyes, the same way a cat does, and reacted the same way a cat would when you shine a light on it. Startled, but angry. It was hideous, and all of us screamed at the same time. All of us ran as fast as we could, no questions asked. We really don't have any idea what we saw that night, but some of us like to think it was a goblin.